Imagine this. The world's highest court issues a direct order. A person's life is literally on the line, and one of the most powerful nations on earth just doesn't follow through. Now, this isn't some Hollywood script. It's a real-life legal drama that went down at the International Court of Justice, and it really pushed the whole idea of international law to its absolute limit. And that brings us to the big, kind of uncomfortable question at the heart of this whole thing. What good is the world's court if a country can just ignore what it says? This one case gives us a pretty stark and, honestly, a fascinating answer. So, to really get how we got to this crisis point, we've got to rewind a few years, back to a huge judgment that basically lit the fuse for this entire showdown. Okay, so it all kicks off in 2004. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, hands down something called the Avena Judgment. It basically said the U.S. had violated the rights of 51 Mexican nationals on death row and ordered the U.S. to review and reconsider their cases. But then, just a year later, the U.S. pulls out of the very treaty that gave the court the power to rule in the first place. So by 2008, you've got this 4-year gap where that court order has just been sitting there, not acted on. So you have this legal argument just kind of simmering in the background for years, and then suddenly it's about to boil over into a life-or-death emergency, forcing Mexico to sprint back to the court. And here's the trigger. In 2008, the state of Texas set an execution date for one of those men, Jose Ernesto Medellin, August 5th. All of a sudden, there's a ticking clock. That old Avena Judgment wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was at the center of a major international test. Now, this is really important. Medellin wasn't the only one. When Mexico rushed back to the court, they also named these 4 other men who, as the court put it, were at risk of execution in the coming months. So the stakes just got incredibly high, with multiple lives now hanging in the balance. So you might be wondering, how did Mexico even get this back in front of the court? I mean, the U.S. had already pulled out of the original agreement. They couldn't just file a new case. So they used this really clever legal backdoor, something called Article 60. They asked the court for an interpretation of the old judgment, arguing that there is now a dispute over what it actually meant. And this is where it turns into a fascinating game of legal chess. The United States didn't come out and argue against the old judgment. Nope, they played a totally different and pretty unexpected card. All right, this is where it gets really good. Mexico's argument was this. The U.S. is acting like this is an obligation of means, meaning they just have to try to comply. Mexico said, no, it's an obligation of result. You have to actually get it done. And the U.S. response? It was a brilliant move. They just said, you know what? You're right. We completely agree. It is an obligation of result. And with that, they set their trap. If we agree, there's no dispute. And if there's no dispute, the court has no reason to be involved. Game over. But what even is a dispute to the ICJ? Well, if you look at the court's history, the definition is actually really broad. You don't need formal protests or anything like that. A simple difference of opinion can be enough. In fact, the original French version of the law uses the word contestation, which the court itself has said is even wider. And here's how the court threaded that needle. In their first emergency order, they said, okay, even if you both agree on the type of obligation, there still appears to be a difference of opinion about its meaning and scope. Like, does this order apply to a state like Texas or just to the federal government? For the court, that was just enough of a disagreement to say, yep, we have jurisdiction here, at least for now. So, with their jurisdiction hanging by a thread, the court issued that emergency order. But the vote was shockingly close. And what happened next would defy the court and just completely shake up this whole case. The court ordered the United States to take all measures necessary to make sure those 5 men were not executed while they figured things out. But just look at that vote. 7-5. That is not a strong, unified decision. That's a court that is seriously divided on the issue. And those 5 judges who voted no, they argued pretty forcefully that, look, there's just no dispute here to interpret, so we shouldn't even be involved. They felt this new order didn't really add any protection beyond the original Avena Judgment, and they worried that this whole thing could set a bad precedent, encouraging countries to misuse the system just to get a case back in court. And then it happened. Less than 3 weeks after the World Court ordered a stop to the executions, Jose Medellin was executed by the state of Texas. The court's direct order had been openly defied. So that execution creates this shocking new reality. Months go by. And then in January 2009, the court comes out with its final official judgment on Mexico's request. And its conclusion, it's a remarkable paradox. In that final ruling, the court actually sided with the U.S. on the big legal question. it decided there really wasn't a dispute over the meaning of the Avena Judgment after all. And because of that, it couldn't grant Mexico's request. So on the surface, it looks like a total win for the United States. But, and this is a huge but, in the very next breath, the court delivered this singer. It said that things like domestic law or the way the U.S. government is structured can't be an excuse. The obligation from that original judgment was still in effect, and the United States was still required to follow it. It was this powerful legal statement, basically reminding the U.S. that its international promises are more important than its internal politics. So where does that leave us? The case of Jose Medellin is just this stark reminder that the ICJ doesn't have an army. It has no police force. It totally relies on countries choosing to cooperate. And when they don't, its orders can be ignored. But it also shows the court's other kind of power. Even when it lost, it still put on the record a fundamental principle of international law. And the question this whole thing forces us to ask is, in the long run, which of those two powers really matters more?